Okay, hello, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, and welcome to the fifth talk in the lecture series that we are calling In Situ, the Modern Concrete Skyscraper. And today we go to the global south, to Australia, in order to look at the work of a really extraordinary architect, a modernist, an extreme modernist, Harry Seidler, who practiced in Australia in the post-war period from the 1960s on. And his work, unfortunately, is not that well known in the United States. And I hope, but we do have the best person in order to reveal Seidler to us, Vladimir Belagolovsky, who has for quite a few years now dedicated himself to the project of making Harry Seidler's work better known. I myself was lucky to travel to Sydney a couple of times and to have a tour of these extraordinary buildings. And Harry Seidler did work across the board in many typologies. Vladimir will mention some of those to us. But he also was a skyscraper architect, and he built the first, as per our title of the talk tonight, Sydney's first modern skyscraper. And of course, it's built in concrete. And so it seemed appropriate to make a focus first on Australia Square, but to invite Vladimir to show more broadly the experiments in high-rise design that Seidler was responsible for in Australia, but also in Hong Kong and other places. So exploring the career of Seidler, we could have no better guide than Vladimir Belagolovsky. Vladimir is a curator and a writer. He has a not-for-profit through which he organizes his curatorial efforts, and it's called the Curatorial Project. He's worked on architectural exhibitions of a great variety. In fact, he's done over 50 exhibitions in his career. He's trained as an engineer in the Ukraine. He went to the Cooper Union School of Architecture, and he started on this career of bringing together writing and exhibition work, including the design and even the entrepreneurial effort of touring the shows. And he will describe to us his background or the introduction to Seidler in the work and how he got onto the idea of making Seidler's work more visible to a world of kind of Eurocentric and American-centric understanding of the modernist movement, which ignores the global South generally, but where Australia is a bit of an outlier. And so we're delighted tonight to be able to reveal some of the brilliance in both architectural aesthetics and also the engineering innovations that and the beauty of engineering that's present in Seidler's work in collaboration with Pier Luigi Nervi. And for that part of the conversation, which will come after Vladimir's presentation, we'll be joined once again by Tom Leslie, the guest curator for the exhibition that we are going to present in the fall, in the winter, spring, excuse me, get to the next slide. The series precedes that, and here's some of the buildings that we have already looked at in Chicago, the Chicago-based DeWitt Chestnut Building by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, the Marina City, the Pirelli Tower, the CBS building. And the Pirelli Tower was also a collaboration with Nervi and the Italian architect Joe Ponti. So one of the things that we're doing in looking beyond the boundaries of the US is exploring the concrete tradition that existed in Europe and in places where architects were trained within that tradition as the Austrian-born later Australian architect Harry Seidler was. So let me invite, after I show you this slide, one of the publications on Seidler's work by Vladimir Belagolovsky, and a second one with the Seidler exhibition, because this show has traveled to more than 30 cities around the world. And here is the exhibition catalog in effect. It's both a catalog of the exhibition or the exhibitions, as well as an introduction to an overview of Seidler's work. And it's beautifully produced and all by Vladimir. So he's a multi-talented individual who also writes for a number of architectural publications, does interviews on video, and has started his own YouTube channel with videos of interviews of architects. So Vladimir, let me invite you onto the screen now, and I will stop my screen share and allow you to take over and give us a tour of Harry Seidler's Skyscrapers.
Let me start with this first slide. So it's a still from a footage in which architect Harry Seidler is flying over Sydney. This is happening around late 1970s. He looks down upon his adopted city, and he says, "I find that the most upsetting thing about our whole society is the fact that we simply lost the battle for trying to create a decent human environment for people to live in." Of course, the same can be said about many cities wherever you are right now watching this. He continued, Sydney is one of the most gorgeous cities in the world, but what man has done to it leaves much to be desired. So we will examine 5 buildings by Seidler chronologically. All are made of reinforced concrete to fit the series of talks organized by Skyscrapers Museum. Speaking of each of these buildings, we will inevitably go beyond their footprint and into the public realm around them. And now I want to start with and spend most of the time on Australia Square. This is a 50-story building, office building, circular tower. This is in central Sydney. Arguably, it is the tallest. When it was built, it was the tallest lightweight concrete structure in the world, concrete building in the world. I said arguably because, for example, in Philip Drew's books, it is mentioned that this building was or is 182.5 meters tall. And Marina City, for example, is which was built a little bit before in Chicago, that is 179 meters. But in other sources like Wikipedia and even my own book, the dimension is a little shorter. So that's why I said arguably, but it's more or less the same height as Marina City. So we're looking at this cylindrical tower as it shoots up like a rocket from the so-called keyhole stairs that connect 2 levels of a public plaza right before the building. It's a kind of beautiful utopian vision. Australia Square is Australia's first true modernist icon. Was built a few years before Sydney Opera House, which you can see on the right image in the upper part, which is still under construction. And it is kind of based on a concept of a city within a city. Well, like a city in miniature. And the model for that was probably such projects as Rockefeller Center in New York City. And for this to happen, more than 30 properties were amalgamated and developed. The project was developed into a single, an entire city block was developed in central Sydney. And I will quote Sydney critic Elizabeth Fairley, who said, Australia Square gave Sydney a sense of growing up, a sense of confidence. It was really our first glittering version of a skyscraper. And now, here is a 13-story office building, which was a part of this development. It was built along one of the edges of the property. And so it's interesting that while the rest of the site was still acquired, not even built, this building was already built and earning money for the whole development. And this kind of tree-like columns, which were, according to Seidler, did not achieve this building's full potential elegance. And he, to build his main part of this project, which would be a tower, at that point, he didn't really know what kind of tower. He started traveling around the world. He went to New York. He met with Philip Johnson. He met with I.M. Pei. I have to remind that I.M. Pei was Seidler's classmate from GSD. And I.M. Pei was, in fact, even invited to be an architect together with Seidler in this project. But eventually, when Seidler realized that he gained enough knowledge, he told the developer that he could do it really himself. By that time, he already had in his mind what kind of building this was going to be. This is the developer of this project. It was really the first mega project in Sydney, and his own mega project, Gerardus or Dick Dusseldorp. He was a Dutch engineer who came to Australia in 1950. And he was there for the new business opportunity for the company that he worked for, which was from Holland, a major building company. And soon he formed a joint venture, which was called Civil and Civic. And that, in turn, in a few years, became what is now known as Lend-Lease, a giant global development and construction company. And Dusseldorp actually hired Seidler a few years before to build what was called Ithaca Gardens apartment complex in Sydney. And so Australia Square was already a second major project with Seidler, and together they developed really a long-lasting, in fact, lifelong collaboration. Australia Square is really has three primary elements. First is, of course, 50-story circular tower, then 13-story plaza building, and a bi-level plaza, a public plaza in the center of the city. The tower occupies about 25% of the block. The total floor space in the tower is 12 times the site area. And in plan, in fact, it's not an ideal circle. It's 20-sided polygon. And there are 20 exterior columns that taper as they rise to give a kind of elegance to the building, very graceful appearance. And the circular tower was developed to avoid a kind of canyon effect. It also created unusual spatial relationships with buildings, conventional buildings around it. Apparently, it admits more sunlight, and the cylindrical form effectively resists wind forces. And its round form is also a very economical solution, and it's a very kind of effective solution. And the building is about 135 feet or 41 meters in diameter, and this dimension was chosen instead of the maximum permissible rectangular tower, which would have been 36.5 by 30.5 meters. And this choice resulted in additional 200 square meters per floor. So this was a very effective form. And this became an opportunity for Seidler to work with Pier Luigi Nervi, a famous Italian engineer, for the first time. His contribution is visible particularly in the design of the columns and curved interlocking ribs, and particularly on the lower two floors. And after Nervi's death in 1979, Seidler continued working with his associate, Mario Desideri. And so most of the large projects were developed, in fact, in collaboration with Nervi. And these are the kind of projects that Nervi was famous for: a large span exhibition spaces and sports arenas. And here you can see the building's round form, which allows speedy construction. And in fact, all beam slabs and facade elements are identical. The columns are not identical, but on each floor they are identical. And construction was very fast, and it took only 4 days per floor, including the exterior. And here you see the curved interlocking ribs in the ceilings of the lower floors. And these ribs are there to allow to carry additional weight because the first floor was an exhibition space floor. Here you can see a model on the left of that ground floor ceiling, and the rest of the floors have a radial spike plan of repetitive beams. And it's interesting that rib ceiling has 40 pairs of curved interlocking ribs, so twice as many as there are columns. And here you can see better images of the model that shows the lower part of the building. And here is really a quintessential Nervi building. All parts are subordinated to the overall form. There is no separation between considerations of statics and aesthetics, and structure and form in a way have become an integral unity. And in fact, Australia Square was designed in the same intentions. And the structural elements are left all exposed, so you can see it here. And the facade is made of precast white quartz faced permanent formwork. Here is a portion of the bi-level plaza between the tower and the plaza building with the central fountain. There is a restaurant here with low curved walls that act as visual screens and visual screens from traffic and wind barriers. And there is a central fountain and a sculpture which is on the other side of the building. And here's the sculpture. So the project presented also for the first time for Seidler to work with a world-class architect, world-class sculptor. And he had a conversation with the developer, Seidler, and he said, look, we are going to design this modern symbol for Sydney. It's going to be a really important, prominent symbol of modernity. It would be great if we had a world-class sculpture. And he said that I wouldn't settle for anything less than the best in the world. And then the developer asked the architect, so where do you get that kind of sculpture? And he said, well, obviously, you have to travel around the world to find it. And so he agreed to finance, the developer agreed to finance a world-round trip that took 1 month of Harry and Penelope Seidler, his wife. And they traveled around the world in search of not a sculpture, but a sculptor who would design such a sculpture. And they visited such prominent artists as Henry Moore, Isamu Noguchi, Harry Bertoya, and Alexander Calder, both in America and in Europe. And in the end, it was Calder who was commissioned. It's a large, stable, crossed blades, which is kind of symbolizes tense fusion of art and technology, which you can also read in many of the Seidler buildings, this idea of fusion. And the building's ground floor lobby originally displayed two tapestries. So you see one here, it's called UNESCO. It's designed by Le Corbusier for the UNESCO building in Paris in 1956. And in 1966, Harry and Penelope commissioned a special edition of this work for Australia Square. And in 2003, years later, when the building was renovated, it was decided to sell those tapestries and design something different. So Seidler commissioned Saul Levitt, and he actually worked with him on some of his other projects in Sydney. And so Saul Levitt designed this round mural which was installed in 2003. And the Le Corbusier tapestry was sold in an auction. It was acquired by a person who installed it in his private house and then eventually donated it to the government of Australia. And now it's in the atrium of the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. And here are some of the spaces of the tower. So you can see the restaurant is on the 47th floor. There used to be an observation deck on the 48th floor, which is no longer there because there are taller buildings. And then there are two floors at the very top, mechanical floor. So you can see a kind of plan of some of the executive spaces in the building. And throughout the building, there were murals and tapestries by such architects as artists as Calder, Miro, and also Norman Carlberg, with whom Seidler collaborated a lot. And here are some of the references. This was Australia Square was the first major urban project for Seidler, so it was in a way idealized project. And it's not a surprise that he used such references from early Renaissance and high Renaissance examples as shown here. And I think it's important to refer to this project, which was a house, his own house, Seidler's and Penelope Seidler's own house. And it's important not even so much for the house itself, but for the collection they were able to install there, because a lot of the collection is really based on geometry of a circle. A lot of the work was done by Joseph Albers, who was a teacher of Seidler at Black Mountain College, and some of the students of Seidler, such as American artists Norman Carlberg and Charles Perry. And we will see some of their work. Also, there were pieces by Calder and paintings by Stella, such as one you can see on the left. And these artworks are often, as I mentioned, based on the geometry of a circle. And the house, it's interesting that the house has no curves, but the artworks do. And his architecture, in a way, shifts from around late 1960s from focusing on orthogonal geometry to geometry of curvilinear geometry and geometry of circles, particularly quadrants and semicircles. And this is the next building. It's a complex which is planned as a system of 7 rectangular office blocks. So this is Edmund Barton building, originally the trade group offices in Canberra. And all of these blocks, 7 blocks, are 16 meters wide, 5-story high. They're connected by circular access and utility cores in the corners, and creating 2 open courtyards between them. The ground floor is largely open, so the building is easily, well, originally it was easily accessible, and the courts were accessed, open to the public. So here you see the plan. It's a very basic, very simple plan. And there are basically just several elements. So there are columns and 2 types of T-planks or beams along the facade and across. And so this is precast columns, half a story high. And then, so the beams, the long beams along the facade are 26 meters long, and the ones across are about 16. And so it's a precast post-tensioned T-beams of floor planks. And in a way, nothing is hidden here. In a way, it's a kind of honest building, which is built. So here you can see a close-up shot from one of the courtyards. So the structure consists of just, again, as I mentioned here, I should have mentioned it, 3 elements. There are columns that hold just 2 types of beams, which is a combination of post-tensioned and pre-stressed beams. And the building is built like a kit of parts. So see here, you can see them under construction. And so large beams were erected by using moving gantry cranes. And it took only 7 minutes from the ground to the final stop. And here we have the key components of the structure: T-sectioned pre-stressed planks that span almost 16 meters, while post-tensioned spandrel beams span nearly 25 meters. And here's a close-up view of primary structural elements. They are all left exposed, unadorned. The stainless steel caps of the pre-stressed anchors are visible here. And so these are spandrel beams. And this detail is quite curious because there is a very direct reference to Otto Wagner's postal savings bank in Vienna. Vienna was the city Seidler was from. So this is this aluminum heads of the bolt here are used in a way as decorative elements for also a symbolic reason. And what is very unusual and totally unexpected is the plan of this building. It's well, it's a site plan, a roof, and well, it's a site plan, and in a way, it evokes a kind of beautiful geometric landscape or an abstract painting with geometric objects defined by quadrants, semicircles, circles. And this plan is, in a way, serves as a kind of genetic code because it anticipated many of the Seidler's buildings that will be built years later. And there is a very high dependency of some of this, well, many of these elements on the work of Norman Karlberg, the sculptor, who collaborated for many years with Seidler. And these two sculptures in the courtyards by Karlberg. So this based on modulars, which is a very similar concept to how Seidler's buildings were built. Here, it's the Australian Embassy in Paris. It occupies a narrow triangular site at the left bank. The complex consists of two wings, two extruded quadrants, and one is a chancellery with ambassador's apartment at the top, and the second building is for Australian diplomats. And through the narrow gap between the two parts of the building, you can see the Eiffel Tower, which is just 400 meters away. This is the site, and very close is the UNESCO building, which was built 20 years before by the group of architects Breuer, Nervi, and Bernard Zerfus. And so almost the same team was invited for this project. Seidler invited Breuer and Nervi. And here you can see you can recognize Breuer's contribution to the design of sun awnings and this kind of stepped profile of the building and the design of the windows. And this is the plan. And below you can see one of the paintings by Stella, which was another very important collaboration between Seidler and Stella. And so especially paintings from Stella's series, protractor series. And so here you see a contribution of Nervi. So it was the design of this parabolic form of the tree-like two-story pylon, which defined porte cochere, kind of ceremonial porte cochere. And here are some of the images during the construction. And so Nervi also designed standardized precast concrete T-beams. And here in the model form, you can see these T-beams and planks following the quadrant shaped curves of the two buildings of the embassy. And here are some of their interiors. Here on the left, you are looking from behind the pylon at porte cochere. On the upper right, you can see the ground floor exhibition space. In fact, my Seidler exhibition was presented here in 2016. And then you see the auditorium, and on the right, lower right, there is a photo of the penthouse of the ambassador overlooking the Eiffel Tower. And this is MLC. It's a much larger building, much taller, 67 stories versus 50 of Australia Square. It was for many years the tallest building in the city. There are 8 massive external columns. They also change in shape as they go up. And this is all obviously also designed by Nervi. There were 23 individual properties amalgamated for this project. So it was done similarly to Australia Square. There are many public functions, and there's a large bi-level plaza occupying sunny northern part of the site. And it's reminiscent of bustling medieval towns that you can find in Italy, such, like Siena, for example. And this is Campidoglio, which is also obviously one of the references for Seidler for many of his public plazas. And some details of the design. Nervi designed columns that twist and turn upwards at the base for greater lateral stability, and they also express kind of very Baroque character. Here you see the reflected ceiling plans of the tower, and there is a restaurant upper left, and the lobby of theater, Royal Theater here. And the reason for a particular configuration and twist into, from square to a diamond is the location of railroad tunnel under the site. So it's a very precise form and location. And here you see Charles Perry's bronze sculpture Mercator in the lobby. And it seems, I think it's important to see it in reference to Seidler's own work, because it seems like it's a very flamboyant, very expressive structure on the left. But in fact, if you look closely, it's a repetition of a single element, a semicircular wire, which is formed into a cube. And here is another mushroom-like building which is a part of MLC. It's a UFO-like structure, kind of a spaceship on a stick or a flower. It has a very distinctive form for a distinctive function. And there are 2 floors occupied by a hotel run by Commercial Travelers Association Club. And these are some of the interiors, including the theater, the lobby. And there is, so the next building is Hong Kong Club. It's a smaller version of, so the Hong Kong Club is on the right side, and it's a smaller version of HSBC headquarters competition entry, which Seidler lost to Norman Foster in 1979. This was an invitation competition. There were 6 architects invited, Seidler included. And this was very much favored, this project by Seidler, by the chairman of the jury. So after the competition, he called Seidler and he said, sorry about the bank, would you like to do a club, Hong Kong Club? So he happened to be the president of the club, and he commissioned Seidler directly to design this project. So here, this is the model that used to be on display at the Bank of China, designed by I.M. Pei, which is the tall building here. And you can see the relationship of this building to others in central Hong Kong. And so this is on the left. This is the original building. It's a kind of neo-Renaissance building occupied by the club, which is right at the center. It was right across from Cenotaph, which is a war memorial next to Statue Square. And if you look at the right, so the shadow, so you can see the building of City Hall. It's a small 2-story building on the right in the shade, and the shadow that cuts the site in front of the building diagonally. That's the shadow that comes from HSBC by Norman Foster. The building is divided into 2 basic parts. The club occupies 4 lower floors. The upper part is all floors by offices to rent, to earn money for the club. Here you see the interiors. They showcase most fluid Seidler spaces anywhere, which is explained by the low cost of labor in Hong Kong. And so inside there are spiral stairs, curved low and full height walls, floor cutouts. They are intricately woven into tight, seamless composition. And in this composition, walls and and floors in ways switch roles. So these are some of their inspirations that go back to Renaissance examples. And here's the structurally expressive scooped out T-beam. These beams are again shaped to better perform structurally, produce maximum effect aesthetically. And the top flange, you can see how it bulges out in the center to increase compression resistance, and then the section of this beam changes as you come across from left to right. These are plans, very expressive plans of the club, this butterfly-like form. There are 4 main columns, massive columns that also change in section. Kenneth Frampton said that Hong Kong Club is a pyrotechnic display of plastic exuberance. So this really concludes the presentation. I just want to skip this because I think this was already mentioned. And finally, I want to end with this image of the MLC tower shooting up like a rocket from similar to Australia Square keyhole stairs that connect 2 levels of public plaza right before the building. And it's an idealistic utopian vision. And I think you will agree that Seidler's buildings are not only sculptural, beautiful objects, but in fact, he tried to and often succeeded in improving quality of urban environment around his building, something that he complained from the helicopter in the beginning, but I think his buildings really improved and made an effect on the quality of urban space in cities where he built. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. Beautiful presentation, and of course, beautiful buildings that don't get recognized or spoken about enough, I think, in North America in particular. And just perfect examples of concrete's versatility in high rises. I love the fact that you compared or showed as a precedent Raphael's Tempietto compared with Australia Square, and I've often thought that was the kind of high Renaissance version. And then the Borromini comparison means that Seidler is able to do, you know, the whole 15th and 16th century, right? Put in concrete instead of in stone. And I think that speaks to the way that the concrete is malleable, not just formally, but just as a almost conceptually, right? That it can do things that steel can't in terms of developing structure, particularly into a language. The precast girders that get their start really in Canberra, which I think is just a hugely underrated building, right? Like that diagram is so rigorous, and the resolution is just, you know, all the way down into the details. The way that in the Hong Kong building, it reflects, as you say, the compression flange gets wider in the middle where the moment is greater. And it can be a T-beam because those are post-tensioned girders. So the tension is all taken by the cable, which you don't see. And you couldn't, you know, in steel, that would just be a giant W shape, right? There'd be no possible expression. The question that I'd like to throw at you is that, you know, you showed the UNESCO building, the collaboration between Nervi and Breuer that happened a decade or so before Australia Square. And that project, I've always thought, you know, neither Nervi nor Breuer were the same after that. They both came away from that project just completely changed as designers. Breuer goes on to really emphasize the rawness of concrete, right? What we today call brutalism. Nervi goes on to be thinking much more about structural shapes. UNESCO is the first place where he develops these kind of piers that change section. But when he works with Seidler, the collaboration is interested in expressing concrete, but in a very different way. And it's no longer brutalism, but it's more like what Vincent Scully called precisionism, right? That concrete can be both very raw and it can be very precise. And Canberra in particular feels like, that is a high-tech building, right? That could be a Renzo Piano building or a Norman Foster building. And I wonder if you could speak to, Breuer and Seidler both come from European modernism, but they both use the same material toward very different ends. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit towards Seidler's interest in kind of detail and in control of finishes and surfaces, and how Nervi's expertise in particular played into that.
Yeah, I think the difference, at least in the case of Seidler and Breuer, there is a major difference. Seidler really learned from Breuer. And so he already kind of took so many ideas as the answer, and he was more like a refiner. And so I think Breuer was a lot more kind of experimental in his work, to the point that for example, some of his early houses would fail, because of the cantilevers were would reach too far. In Seidler's work, he was a lot more careful, much more calculated, and much more refined. So he wouldn't be afraid to maybe follow some of the examples, but he would be really focused on bringing together what was already known. And he would sometimes, I think, work in a way as a conductor. He would bring different talents to his projects, whether architects or engineers or artists. And he would, as I mentioned in our conversations before, he would point to them exactly what he wanted from them. So in a way, he was an experimentator. He would experiment, of course, but he also relied on, what his collaborators were capable of. And that was really the reasons why he would invite them to his projects. Like, for example, I forgot to mention that Nervi, when he was invited to work on Australia Square, he didn't have much experience in working on skyscrapers. It was his only third skyscraper. He only did Pirelli Tower in Milan and that building in Montreal. But Seidler knew why he wanted Nervi, for what reason. So he would, he would be very specific, he would be very precise, and he would ask him to work specifically on certain elements, and he would almost suggest where he should focus his talent, his efforts. So, and this is how he worked with even with some of their artists. So there would be a limited degree of freedom working with Seidler.
We were speaking just before your talk about the fact that Seidler knew what he was getting when he approached Nervi, and you mentioned that was the same for a lot of the artists, that Seidler was, as you say, orchestrating these ideas, these approaches, seeing, I think, in Nervi a kind of someone who had similar fascination with structure, but also a similar fascination with sort of rigor. Right, that the rigor of Australia Square is just very clearly, there's an alignment there that, interestingly, like in Seidler's case, changes. Right, Canberra is very rigorous, but MLC begins to get a little bit freer. And then, of course, Hong Kong, Pier Luigi Nervi had died just before that project started. So in some ways, like, he doesn't have the collaborator who reinforced maybe that sense of overall rigor, that there's something much more free, much more flowing that maybe Seidler felt freer to do without Nervi as a collaborator.
Yeah, and what is interesting, if you follow the development of Seidler's career, the difference from decade to decade is just incredible. And that had to do with references. He would constantly bring new references. When he started his career, he was not interested in forming his own voice at all. He was actually very happy with what he learned directly at Harvard from Gropius, what he learned from Breuer, where he worked for 2 years right after graduation. And his early projects were really trying to focus on how to make it more perfect. He was not interested in reinventing architecture in his own way. And then eventually, as he brings more and more people into his work, his orbit, and so there are more and more ideas coming, and his work starts to change. So, for example, this building in Canberra, as you mentioned, underappreciated. This was really the first building where his architecture, which is still, if you look at the plan, very orthogonal, but it starts to shift into curvilinear. So all of a sudden there is a curvilinear language, which is discovered in the work of artists that he started working with. And very often ideas that he picks up, they come into his work almost without much transformation. You can recognize Carlberg's work in his buildings, and he was actually very happy doing it, because he wrote letters to Carlberg saying, "Look, my buildings are becoming like your sculptures," and so he admitted it right away, and he liked it. He liked that possibility, that geometric possibility.
Right. And we just have a couple of minutes left. So to close, I think I want to back away just a little bit from Seidler and talk about the building as a kind of moment in time in Australia, but also in the kind of global construction industry. And that relates to the fact that if you're building a tower this big in Australia in the 1960s, why would you do it in concrete instead of steel? And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the way the material was a natural choice for not just Seidler, but for Australia in general, and why concrete in particular was so important to this project at this time in that country.
Well, as far as choice of concrete, I think a lot was picked up from some of the projects by Oscar Niemeier, for whom he worked right before coming to Australia. He learned a lot from it. He wanted to learn from it because one of the major reasons was a similar climate. So he brings some of those ideas, and he immediately starts to work with concrete that allows many of those ideas to be expressed. And it is concrete that allowed him to be sculptural. He didn't work with concrete for many years since the time he came. It already he started working with concrete already in much later, in the 60s, about 20 years after he came. And the reason is the expressive qualities. And by that time, he was already working with artists, and he liked this idea that buildings could be left unadorned. And he saw it not only as a way to express sculptural qualities, but also as very economical way of building, because the structure became also the finished product. There was no need for additional facades. And I think that was the reason for working with concrete.
Yeah. And that to me is really interesting, because Australia Square, what you're seeing actually is precast cladding for the most part. And it's the later projects, MLC Center in particular, where you are actually seeing the material that's doing the work, right? The curvilinear beams are, again, like the Hong Kong project, really shaped to reflect the stresses that they're undergoing. So in a funny way, like the freer architectural buildings are actually showing you more honestly what's going on, at least at a detail level, than Australia Square is, I suppose.
What we also shouldn't forget is that these buildings were really the products of their time. Because if you look at the work of Seidler later on, no longer they are as honest, no longer they are unadorned concrete. So this is the time when curtain wall is getting introduced, and he used curtain wall in many of those later buildings. So this a lot of it has to do with construction techniques of the time and what's available, what the building industry could offer. So this is also very important, because the buildings we saw today, they represent a certain time in his work, and then you can see how they changed as the building industry changed.
Right. Yeah, they reflected the technologies that were available, and that's shown in the precast cladding and the roof of the ceiling of the lobby in Australia Square, very appropriate to kind of early 1960s. But then post-tensioning, which is a perfectly applicable technique if you're trying to build a tower out of precast, that cabling really comes into its own in kind of the mid to late 1960s, at least on that scale. And I think there's also a really the interest in how those precast members in particular are fabricated and assembled. Those amazing shots of the gantry cranes picking things up, that clearly reflects the kind of economics of labor and material that were a very particular balance in Australia at the time as well. So yeah, just an absolutely fascinating set of projects and buildings, and a group that I think expands our horizons, right? As we've been talking, our examples have been in Chicago and New York, and one in Milan. But to understand concrete's kind of global reach, I think getting to as far afield as Sydney is really important, and seeing that a lot of the same issues are at play there, but they're handled in this case by someone who's come to Australia by way of Europe, but clearly working with a set of rules, a palette of materials that are like similar but different in ways that I think are really good. So, Carol, do you want to jump in with anything to conclude here?
Tom, you've perfectly summarized, I think, all of those points, and even stole the phrase expanding our horizons that I was planning to use myself. So I will instead say thank you for explaining, Vladimir, the Seidler's work and the international style in a truly international context, and helping us to see the places where modernism asserts both its theory and practice around the world in our often too narrow and siloed appreciation of countries and influence and masters and those people with whom we are already familiar. And Seidler is clearly a great architect, a great modernist, and had great collaborators, and a master of kinds, as you've explained, who changes from adopting and presenting a style accepting a style and then representing it to really kind of mastering a voice through his architecture, which is also a fascinating set of ideas with which I think we need to grapple with all of the architects who practiced in this period and in the shadow of the masters of modernism. So thank you for all of that, for sharing all of your enormous knowledge and background and research in Seidler. And thanks, Tom, for a really excellent conversation to move all those ideas forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
So bye, everybody. See you next time.